Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so today in our video lesson, we are going to be summarizing or refreshing the concepts that were discussed in class, which is the process of fermentation. So let me start sharing my whiteboard real quick, and then we can get into that. And here it is. So, fermentation. Now, one thing that and let me just get my spotlight real quick so that way we can kind of go over what we're doing. So one thing that we need to understand is that the cells in our body cannot store large amount of oxygen for cellular respiration. Like and to be exact, when we talk, when we breathe, when we're doing activity that is not strenuous, we're not exercising, or we're not moving heavy objects, the oxygen that we produce by breathing is enough to keep us, or produces sufficient energy to sustain us. But when we start exercising, or when we start moving heavy objects, and all of a sudden our muscles get tired and sore, and you went to the gym for the first time and I don't know how long, and then the next day you woke up and everything is sore. And that's because you were doing strenuous activity and your body, basically, the oxygen in your muscles is gone, and your body had to continue to produce energy in the absence of oxygen, or use other methods other than cellular respiration. So, what happens is that when our bodies um, don't have oxygen. So in cellular respiration, we know that glycolysis is the first step, which is basically the breaking down of the glucose molecule. So in the process that we're going to talk about today, which is fermentation, the first step is also glycolysis. It just happens that um, fermentation, or lactic acid fermentation, that we're going to talk about in a minute, occurs in the absence of oxygen. Now, one thing that we want to understand is that fermentation is an anaerobic process that allows glycolysis to continue. This process doesn't produce ATP. So, fermentation doesn't produce ATP. It just allows glycolysis to continue, and glycolysis does produce ATP. Granted, it's not a lot of ATP. Remember that in cellular respiration, you can produce up to 38 ATP molecules, and in glycolysis, you produce maybe two at most. So it allows glycolysis to continue so that our bodies can produce oxygen, but it doesn't produce ATP, excuse me, but it doesn't produce a lot. And then here we go. The other thing that we need to know is that it says fermentation removes electrons from NADH to convert it into NAD positive. And this is important because glycolysis needs a molecule to pick up electrons. So basically, what happens in fermentation is that it removes the electrons from the NADH that we have in glycolysis, and that actually allows glycolysis to continue because that NADA plus can continue to get those electrons that they need. Okay. Now, without NAD plus, glycolysis would stop. So another thing is that when high energy electrons, or importance of this is that when high energy electrons are picked up by a eukaryotic cell, are picked up, excuse me, a eukaryotic cell can continue breaking glucose and other simple sugars to make small amounts of ATP. Now, when glycolysis occurs, or when that electron is picked up in eukaryotic cells, we can use other molecules, because our cells we are eukaryotic cell organisms. Because we are eukaryotic cell organisms, we can use other molecules um, to break down, and besides glucose, to break down small sugars, right? But again, it's very important for this to occur so glycolysis can continue, and glycolysis is what produces the energy in the absence of oxygen. It says when glucose has been split, and here's an example of lactic acid fermentation, which is an example of what happens to our muscles when we're exercising and we start getting tired, or we start feeling that burning sensation in our muscles, right? Now, we're using exercise as an example, but it's not just exercise. There are other activities that can cause this to happen. It says when glucose has been split by glycolysis in a muscle cell, and oxygen is unavailable, lactic acid fermentation occurs. Lactic acid causes your muscles to burn during hard exercise. Steps in lactic acid fermentation. So here we're going to talk about the 2 steps. Now, this is a summary. Lactic acid fermentation is a much more complex process, but we're going to talk about the summary of lactic acid fermentation. So the first step is that pyruvate and NADH from glycolysis enters the fermentation process. 2 NADH molecules provide energy to convert pyruvate into lactic acid. As NADH is used, it is converted back into NAD plus. So basically, uh, pyruvate and NADH from glycolysis enter the fermentation process. And then what happens is that the 2 molecules of NADH provide the energy to convert that pyruvate into lactic acid. And as this happens at the same time that the NADH is being used, it's converted back into NAD plus and it's recycled. And the second step says that 2 molecules of NADH, which brings us to our second step coincidentally, 2 molecules of NAD positive are recycled back to glycolysis. The recycling of NAD plus allows glycolysis to continue, and that is going to continue until our cells are oxygenated again. So the lactic acid fermentation process is not a very long process. It actually doesn't last very long at all, because as you're exercising and you're breathing heavily, that's why you begin to breathe heavy when you're tired, when your muscles are out of oxygen, so that way your muscles can fill up with that oxygen, and more ATP can be generated. It's kind of like why in certain exercises between reps you have a rest period, so that your oxygen levels can come back up, so that your muscles can get that energy. Usually the rest period between exercises aren't that long, but again, this is why at the end of exercises you have what they call a cool down. And that cool down just kind of allows your heart rate to go back down and allows you to breathe in normally again, so your muscles can fill up with oxygen. Okay? Now, fermentation is a process that is used in the production of some foods. So, fermentation is not just used in our bodies for lactic acid fermentation, but it's used in the production of certain foods like cheese and yogurts. And this is not the only type of lactic acid fermentation that we have. We actually have alcoholic fermentation, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And alcoholic fermentation actually occurs in plants and yeasts. And this is very important in, for example, pizza dough, which the dough needs to be fermented, um, or the yeast that is used to make the dough needs to be fermented in order for that dough to rise. Likewise, in the confection of many types of breads. So this is pretty much the same process as lactic acid fermentation, except for the fact that instead of forming um, pyruvate, we have the formation of alcohol and carbon dioxide. So let's go into the steps of alcoholic fermentation. Again, alcoholic fermentation occurs in some plants and yeast, and it is also allows glycolysis to continue to produce ATP. And steps in alcoholic fermentation. So pyruvate and NADH from glycolysis enters the fermentation process. And the first step, notice that it's pretty much the same as in the first step of lactic acid fermentation. So it says that 2 NADH molecules provide energy to break down pyruvate into alcoholic and carbon dioxide. So it breaks down pyruvate into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So it's very similar to the first step here, except that here it converts pyruvate into lactic acid. So again, the first step, pyruvate and NADH from glycolysis enter the fermentation process, and 2 NADH molecules are converted into alcohol um, and carbon dioxide. And this also happens in alcoholic fermentation as it did in lactic acid fermentation. And is that NADH is converted into NAD plus as it is being used. And the second step of of alcoholic fermentation says that the molecules of NAD plus are or Plus just means that it's positive. It's not that it's plus. All right. So NAD or positive NAD or NAD plus are recycled back to glycolysis. The recycling of NAD plus allows the glycolysis to continue just like in lactic acid fermentation. So guys, this has been a summary of the fermentation process of the lactic acid fermentation as well as the um, alcoholic fermentation. So guys, stay safe and we'll see each other in our next class. Bye.